With everything that we've talked about in this particular chapter, we can take a look at our final two concepts, the recessionary gap and the inflationary gap. And basically, the idea behind each of these gaps is that we need to have some type of spending increase or spending decrease in order for the economy to reach its long-run equilibrium output or its full employment output. So here, let's take a look at the recessionary gap first. It's the increase in aggregate spending necessary to bring a depressed economy back to full employment. So the recessionary gap means that we currently are in a recession and we need to have some type of spending increases in order to push us out of the recession. So here, let's go ahead and take a look at how this is actually going to be calculated. The recessionary gap. Recessionary gap. And the easy thing about both of these sort of gaps that we take a look at is that they actually use the same exact formula, but they're going to tell us a few different things. So the recessionary gap is equal to the GDP gap, divided by the multiplier, divided by the spending multiplier, So here the GDP gap itself is not the same as the recessionary gap or the inflationary gap. It's just telling us exactly how far away are we currently from our full employment GDP. In other words, it's full employment GDP, and we subtract out current GDP. So minus current GDP. And once again, positive and negative numbers are going to be important here, so you do want to go ahead and be consistent with this difference right here. So full employment GDP minus current GDP. And full employment GDP is exactly our long-run equilibrium. And if you remember from chapter number 6, excuse me, where we talked about the natural rate of unemployment, this is exactly our GDP at the natural rate of unemployment. So essentially here, this natural rate of unemployment, we have full employment GDP. We call it potential GDP as well, where cyclical unemployment is equal to 0. Basically, it just tells us that it tells us the potential level of GDP that the economy can produce if cyclical unemployment were equal to 0. So in other words, when we want to calculate out this recessionary gap, all we need to do is find the GDP gap and then divide it by our spending multiplier. And the big idea is we don't need to have this full spending of the GDP gap here in order to get out of the recession, because we can make use of the spending multiplier. So a very simple example, I'll just give you a few numbers with this. So here, example, I'll give you a few numbers. Suppose that I tell you that full employment GDP, so FE GDP, just for short, FE GDP is equal to 4,400. Suppose that current GDP is equal to 4,000. And then finally here, let's suppose that I give you an MPC equal to 0.75. So 3 specific numbers that I can provide to you. That's more than enough information to go ahead and calculate out this recessionary gap. So one thing to note is that this recessionary gap is always going to be a positive number. It's the spending increase that we need to have within the economy. So just plugging these numbers into our particular formula that we have right here, our GDP gap, that's going to be full employment GDP, so 4,400, subtracting out our current GDP, 4,000, and then divided by the multiplier. Remember, the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus MPC. We've done it several times already with the same specific number for right here, so we know our multiplier is going to equal to 4. So I'll just go ahead and jot that down. And then when you go ahead, we are going to have 400 over 4. 400 over 4. Remember, this is a positive 400. And we're going to have equal to 100. And what does this positive 100 tell us? It tells us that we must increase spending, by $100 to reach full employment GDP. So here, we must increase spending by $100 in order to reach full employment GDP. So not sure why this is all going away, but here, this is exactly the interpretation that we have with the recessionary gap. And this increase in spending can come from any one of our components of aggregate expenditures. Government spending, consumption, investment, net exports, doesn't really matter as long as we have an increase of $100. And this can exactly help push us out of the recession. So far, so good. Next, we can go ahead and take a look at the exact opposite case where the economy may actually be overheating just a little bit. So in this instance, we actually want to have spending decreases in order to get us back to full employment GDP. And that's what we call the inflationary gap. It's the decrease in aggregate spending necessary to bring an overheated economy back to full employment. And whenever we notice that when our spending is great, when our current GDP is greater than our full employment GDP, that just tells us that we're overheating just a little bit and we want to slow down the economy, and we can do so by having spending decreases. Thankfully for our purposes, once again, this inflationary gap has the same exact formula as before, as the recessionary gap, except now it's going to be a negative number. So here, take a look at the inflationary gap. So the inflationary gap, once again, this is going to be the same exact formula. We have the GDP gap divided by the multiplier. But this is going to be a negative number. So if you come with a positive number, you know it's in the inflationary gap. If it's a positive number, you know it's going to be a recessionary gap. If it's a negative number, you know it's going to be the inflationary gap. Suppose, once again, I just give you a quick example, just changing a few of these numbers up. So example, suppose that I tell you that full employment GDP is equal to 4,000 now. Current GDP is equal to 4,400. So just switching these numbers up. And MPC, as before, is equal to 0.75. So once again, combining all these numbers together into our formula, we need to take the GDP gap. Remember, you want to go ahead and put full employment GDP first. So that's 4,000. Subtract out current GDP, which is 4,400, divided by the multiplier, which is equal to 4. And then you're going to get the same minus 100 over 4. Now here, remember that negative signs do matter. So what exactly minus 400? When we simplify all this, we get minus 100. So what exactly does this minus 100 tell us in this instance? It just says that we need to decrease spending. We must decrease spending by $100 to reach full employment GDP. So here, it just tells us in the opposite direction. We're overheating. The economy is overheating just a little bit. We want to slow it down. And in order for us to get back to our full employment GDP, our potential GDP, we're going to have to decrease spending. So remember, spending decreases can come from consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports. And we're going to go ahead and see a graphical version of each of these gaps in chapter number 9, where we actually bring up aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. And this is just laying the sort of foundations in this particular chapter of the recessionary gap and the inflationary gap, situations where the economy might find itself in the short run, but as we transition to the long run, we know exactly what should be happening. So just putting a few specific numbers to all of this. With all of this in mind, the last sort of slide right here, so this is the Great Depression. We really don't want to talk about depression too much, so don't really worry about this slide right here. Remember, I really don't care too much about history, but we do notice that at the Great Depression, things were very, very bad during the for this economic time period. Unemployment was very high. The stock market fell by quite a large percentage. And this is exactly why John Maynard Keynes came up with this model of aggregate expenditures and why he argued for increases in government spending, because he knew the impact of the multiplier and how that could help improve aggregate or equilibrium income. And it wasn't until the early 1940s where government spending rose 10 times its current amount, which is because of World War II. And World War II actually helped the United States get out of the Great Depression. So this increase in government spending was the primary reason, one of the primary reasons of helping us out of this tough economic time. So this does do it for this particular chapter. A lot of dense material, but hopefully we've broken it down piece by piece so you get that type of knowledge and the type of information behind all of it. Remember, this was just a chapter that tried to sort of bring up a new model, which is a graphical representation of GDP. We broke down each portion of GDP, consumption, investment, government spending, net exports, and saw how all of those play together in order to give us our macroeconomic equilibrium under the aggregate expenditures model. Remember, that ties into the relationship with income as well. And then there are a few things that we talked about, a few idiosyncratic things, such as the average propensity to consume, average propensity to save, marginal propensity to consume, marginal propensity to save, as well as the paradox of thrift. The big idea, once again, is the multiplier, the spending multiplier. This is going to be very, very key for a lot of things for the rest of the semester. And then we'll talk about the recessionary gap and inflationary gap a little bit more in the next chapter. I'll see you guys in the next chapter.